Welcome to Human Geography, Geography 106. We're going to talk about cultural geography, basically many worlds. We're going to go into several different aspects of cultures. So we do have different types of cultures that affect race, religion, gender, related other lines of distinction. So we talk about subcultures, people with norms, values, and material practices that differentiate them from a dominant culture. We have a plural form that emphasizes no single way of seeing, experience, and landscape. Sometimes in geography, we have this concept of perception. Fits into that. Speak of geography raises new questions about the different meanings people have given to landscapes. Once again, speaking to the perceptions. Material, so what's tangible, physical, non-material, beliefs, values, tends to be very cultural, folk, or traditional. Here we're talking about folk, usually has to do with more local, specific beliefs, national tied to more of a nation. Indigenous cultures tends to be the original inhabitants of a place, generally associated with non-urban rural spaces. Here we see a sample of that in northern Thailand. We also have, similar to folk, we have popular culture. Folk is more of a traditionalist, and then not identifying with either one of them is a placefulness. We also have characteristics of popular culture. People are more mobile, less likely to live in a single place. Secular institutions, not necessarily believing in specific religions or specific general, broader beliefs. Individual choice is highly valued. Relationships become stressed over time. And we have disparate cultures, where essentially the different types of beliefs are displaced. For instance, New York having Little Italy. So now we're going to get into regions, cultural regions. So we talk about ice hockey, for example. I used to coach hockey. I really didn't know much about it, but my son essentially started playing, and I was one of the parents that was always there, and so they asked me to start coaching. So, really interesting where Division I men's hockey, ice hockey teams are, mostly in the Northeast. Notice a little bit around Colorado. Lacrosse sounds very similar. By the way, these symbols that are used both in lacrosse and ice hockey maps are called graduated symbol, because they don't exactly represent the area of the values where you see schools right here in the legend. So you have to basically look at what symbol and what value it is. They're not always proportional. Volleyball, another sample. Here's where volleyball plays. My oldest son is playing volleyball in college starting next year. So I showed him this map. He's pretty interested. Indigenous culture regions, few roads, not as many modern communication systems, usually controlled by central government. Rough topography tends to be very rural areas. In many cases, indigenous peoples were fled or forcibly removed. We see this with Native American populations. Prior to my 8 to 5 job, which I'm an enterprise architect at Xcel Energy, I worked for Bureau of Indian Affairs, so I actually worked on quite a bit of the different reservations, settlements, so forth, and a lot of them are in very rural areas. Vernacular culture, cultural region exist by inhabitants. Collective spatial perception, which we discussed before, we tend to see a lot of that in the South in the United States. Sudanese uprising, we also see some of this in the South in terms of the term Dixie. Digital divide, so where do we have things limited? Really great trends that have happened in the United States. There's really been a few of them in terms of technology. One's been the television, how that's distributed through part of the world. And then we essentially had the internet, which really has made more of the world accessible. And then even far reaching than those two has been mobile phones. It's been pretty easy to set up a telecommunications network, and even in third world countries or developing countries, are also called industrializing countries, we see cell phones even reaching that, along with the corresponding networks. Globalization. So we're going to talk about spreading. Convergence hypothesis, essentially where differences among places are reduced or eliminated or influenced. Differences revitalize some local consumption cultures where things happen. Kind of more of the traditional aspect like we talked about before, or folk. Consumer nationalism, local resistance to globalism, globalization or growth. Then we have local indigenous cultures going global. So we kind of see combinations of these. We also have nature culture, or indigenous ecology and biodiversity. People have a close, the theory on this is people have a close tie to the environment in indigenous backgrounds, and a lot of that has to do with the dependency on the land or the environment. Biodiversity. There are different types of ecosystems, flora and fauna, if you will, or also known as biomes, that exist throughout the world, and they're not the same. So depending on where you live, you'd have different types of people, or different types of people and different types of environments that would be influenced. So here we go, congruence of cultural and biological diversity. Really interesting study how that was put together. Indigenous technical knowledge. So along with indigenous having specific knowledge of the environment, same with technical, what types of things that could be done specifically in that environment. And we also have folk ecology, talked about folk culture within the folk groups, essentially what works, what doesn't. Nature and gender, concept of ecofeminism. There's a theory on this in terms of a doctrine that women are inherently better in terms of preserving the environment. Nature and popular culture. Heavy demands on ecosystems for popular culture, which is really interesting. Then we're going to get into cultural landscapes, folk architecture, structures built by a folk society or culture, tends to be more traditional. Here we see this in terms of the French Quarter, which I was there a couple years ago, or a couple months ago, doing a presentation at Distributech, the GIS, or actually a IT utility conference. It's the biggest in the world. But anyway, so we talked about French Quarter, farmhouse, Yankee in the Northeast. You can see all kinds of different types of housing architecture. Architecture throughout the world, Philippines, South Africa. Landscapes of consumption, how much we use depends on where we live. Leisure landscapes, amenity landscapes, depends on your needs and your environment. Elitist landscapes based on wealth. One of the places we see that is the city-state of Monaco in France. City of bigness, cult of bigness, popular landscapes, and so forth. We kind of see popular developments and so forth. One of those would be Walmart. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. This is one of the funnest chapters in the class, this class in general. It was a really good time. Before I started teaching it, I always thought the GIS class would be my favorite, and it's actually turned into this class is by far my favorite. So I hope you enjoy it too.